Eritrea, an ancient nation in the Horn of Africa, fought a long and bloody struggle for its independence against the occupying forces of Ethiopia. After years of fighting, Eritrean forces finally marched into the Ethiopian capital, marking the end of a brutal occupation and the beginning of a new era for Eritrea. In 1991, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, also known as EPLF, launched a massive offensive against the Ethiopian government, known as the Derg. The Derg, which was heavily supported by Eastern European countries, had been in power for almost 2 decades and was known for its ruthless and oppressive rule. But the decline of the Marxist movement in Eastern Europe had weakened the Derg's support and paved the way for Eritrean forces to make their move. The EPLF, led by General Sabhat Ephraim, was determined to free Eritrea from the grip of the Derg. After years of fighting, the Eritrean forces finally marched into the Ethiopian capital, forcing the Derg to escape and flee to Zimbabwe. The EPLF, now in control of Eritrea, wasted no time in selecting a leader for Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, the leader of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, also known as TPLF. The TPLF had been allies and trainees of the EPLF during the struggle for independence. Meles Zenawi and the TPLF would go on to lead Ethiopia for the next 28 years. However, their rule would be marked by heinous crimes against the state of Eritrea, leading to a deep-seated animosity between the two nations. In 1998, tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia erupted into a full-blown border war that lasted for 2 years. The conflict, fueled by years of resentment and mistrust, resulted in the loss of thousands of lives and left a permanent scar on the relationship between Eritrea and the Tigray region of Ethiopia. The deportation of Eritrean people from Ethiopia in 1998 and the seizure of Eritrean assets resulted in the forced separation of Eritrean families and inflicted significant hardship on many individuals. This event had a lasting impact on the lives of those affected, causing immense emotional and economic distress, and further deepening the existing tensions between the two nations. January 25 consultations on Ethiopia-Eritrea. USAN is instructed to extend UNME's mandate for 6 months, continue the temporary security zone, avoid discussing the demarcation decision by map coordinates, support the SYG's efforts to engage the parties, and support efforts to lift restrictions on UNME, particularly the current fuel crisis. The United States expresses deep concern about the impasse between Ethiopia and Eritrea, emphasizing the importance of UNME and the TSZ in stabilizing the region. USAN calls for Eritrea to allow adequate fuel supplies for UNME and comply with all restrictions on its operations, while urging both parties to respect their commitments and work towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles expressed frustration with the UN Security Council's discussion of Belgium's proposals on the demarcation process, arguing that it overlooked the 2 fundamental agreements that guide resolution of the Ethiopia-Eritrea border dispute. Meles presented a set of new proposals to break the impasse and push for direct bilateral discussions with Eritrea. He also suggested the establishment of a UN military observer mission on Ethiopia's side of the border and normalization talks. Meles criticized Eritrea's actions of militarizing the temporary security zone and violating the cessation of hostilities agreement. He called for the UNSC to restore commitment from Eritrea to the Algiers Accord and renounce the use of force. Frustrated with the lack of UNSC action, Meles said Ethiopia will remain quiet and not engage further on the border issue. He also expressed concern over Eritrean President Isaias' incursion into Djibouti, warning that inaction by the UNSC will only encourage further aggression and increase tensions in the region. Despite the frustration, Meles affirmed Ethiopia's support for a UN military observer mission and normalization talks. The violation of the Algiers Agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia was an issue where the EU, UN, and US were complicit. Despite the agreement being final and binding, the international community remained silent, possibly due to Ethiopia aligning with the Western agenda, while Eritrea rejected Western exploitation. This lack of intervention raises questions about the balance of power and interests within international politics. The international community is calling for the implementation and demarcation of the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia after the collapse of their longtime ally, the TPLF. This call is driven by the changing political dynamics in the region and the need to source the next stooge. 23 years ago today, Ethiopia and Eritrea, with the support of the international community, concluded the Algiers Agreement to establish peace and demarcate a common border. In 2018, in a historic peace agreement, both countries recommitted to respect the border as established by the Algiers Agreement and its subsequent Boundary Commission. On this anniversary, we reiterate our full support for the Algiers Agreement and the border as established by its subsequent Boundary Commission. It is more important than ever that the sovereignty and territorial integrity as defined by these agreements is respected by all. This is key for the stability of the entire region. Quoted from the European Union. The Algiers Agreement provided a peaceful and legally binding resolution for the dispute between Eritrea and Ethiopia. While Ethiopia had concerns, they were obligated to respect and adhere to the agreement. Ethiopia's invasion and occupation of Eritrean land far exceeded the objective of defending its borders. The occupation led to prolonged suffering, humanitarian crises, and loss of life. The US and EU support for Ethiopia's occupation were proven in a leaked report released by WikiLeaks and was widely endorsed by international observers and human rights organizations. One of the major points raised against the TPLF-led Ethiopia is its involvement in the border conflict with Eritrea. The Ethiopian government, under the TPLF, failed to fully implement the peace agreement signed in Algiers in 2000, leading to renewed tensions and sporadic clashes between the two countries. This instability negatively affected Eritrea's security and hampered regional peace efforts. TPLF provided support and shelter to various armed opposition groups, including those that aimed to undermine the Eritrean government. By harboring these groups, Ethiopia indirectly contributed to the insecurity and lack of stability in Eritrea, as well as in the wider region. In an attempt to gain control and power, the TPLF partnered with NGOs and the UNHCR to create refugee camps in Tigray, supposedly to provide shelter and aid to those fleeing war and persecution in neighboring Eritrea. However, what was once seen as a humanitarian effort has now been exposed as a strategic move by the TPLF to further disrupt Eritrea's economy and population growth. The refugees invited to Tigray were not given equal treatment. Instead, they were sorted and trained based on their ethnicity and region they came from, with the intention of sending them back to their home country to fight against the government. This not only created division and tension among the refugees, but it also led to a violation of their human rights. Many were forced to fight against their own people, with no say in the matter. But the TPLF's exploitation of refugees does not stop there. Reports have emerged of the Tigray regional people harvesting organs from Eritrean refugees and using their identities to take advantage of the migration crisis in Europe, America, and Australia. All of this has been done under the guise of humanitarian aid, while the TPLF-led Ethiopia continued to gain power and control over the region, whilst advancing Western interests. Today, animosity and distrust between Eritrea and Ethiopia continue. But as the world looks back at the struggle for Eritrea's independence, one thing is clear: the determination and bravery of the Eritrean people will always be remembered as they fought against all odds to gain their freedom. In the end, Eritrea's independence was not handed to them on a silver platter. It was earned through blood, sweat, and tears. And today, Eritrea stands proud as a free and independent nation.